Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third and final discussion event of the spring 2025 semester. This is Under the Golden Dome, which is a virtual panel discussion of events in state and local politics. And this is being hosted by our Department of History and Political Science in the School of Arts and Letters, and is also co-sponsored by the MGA Political Science Student Organization, as well as the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. Most importantly, I do want to let everybody know that the speaker's views are their own and do not represent those of Middle Georgia State University, its organizational units, Pi Sigma Alpha, or any other organizations they may be affiliated with now, in the past, or in the future. Before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. And it looks like they're both here. First we have Dr. Matthew Caverly, who's an assistant professor of public safety, who's been here at Middle Georgia State University since 2016, and his PhD is in political science from the University of Florida. Also, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Hall, who's an associate professor of political science and has been here at Middle Georgia State since 2015, and his PhD is in public policy and administration from Auburn University. And I will be serving as your moderator with a cold today. I am Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm a professor of political science here at Middle Georgia State. I've been here since 2012. And my PhD in political science is from the University of Mississippi. So we have an all SEC panel today. Like I said, I am fighting with a cold here a little bit. So I will try to keep my remarks to a minimum just to avoid the inevitable coughing fit that will emerge if I talk too much. So we'll hear probably more from Dr. Caverly and Dr. Hall than from me. But in terms of ground rules, for those of you that have not joined us before, I just want to let you know that we will get started with a few topics that we have discussed beforehand. We do, however, really want your questions. I encourage you to ask any questions you might have. You can post those in the chat window. We'll keep moderating that during the discussion today over the next hour and a half or so. And the only two caveats there. First, while you're welcome to ask multiple questions, we do want to prioritize making sure that everybody gets an opportunity to ask at least one question. So if you do have multiple questions, feel free to ask, but we may skip over a second or third question for a person until we've had a chance to have everybody who wants to ask a question, just to make sure that we have a pretty fair distribution of questions around the participants. Also, do be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window. You may have points of disagreement with your fellow students and fellow participants today, and that's fine. But do be civil and courteous. Do bear in mind the basic expectations for student conduct and things like that. As far as some of the topics that we expect that we'll probably be discussing today, we'll talk a little bit about the gubernatorial and senatorial primaries. They're coming up in about 7-8 weeks for both the Democrats and Republicans for statewide and federal office here for the midterms, and also the gubernatorial and other statewide contests. We'll also be talking a bit about the legislative session this year, and particularly we'll talk a little bit about the state budget, and also potential new laws that might affect your lives in various areas, including education, taxes, election security, all sorts of other things too. So lots of things on the potential agenda there. So I will go ahead and drop this sharing and get us started with our first question. And now that I've clicked all the buttons, let's see. So our first question, which we circulated beforehand, is dealing with the governor's race. So the governor's race is heating up on both sides, with aggressive campaigning underway for both the Republican and, to a lesser extent, the Democratic nominations in the run-up for the May 19th primaries. So first, what are some of the major issues that are separating the candidates in these races? And does it appear that there are any front runners at this point? And I guess we'll go ahead and let Dr. Hall lead off on that one if he wants to.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dr. Caverly, for being with us. Thank you, other faculty and students, for taking time out of your busy afternoons to join us here for this Georgia politics discussion. So to kick things off about the gubernatorial race, to make sure we're all up on the same at the same speed, it's important to note that there's been a relatively popular governor of the state of Georgia by the name of Brian Kemp, and he is not running again. Obviously, the reason for him not running again is the fact that he is term limited. So that creates a situation that's somewhat rare in that early in 2026 of a gubernatorial election year, we have a race that is fundamentally wide open. The Democratic Party, I'm going to start with first, because while they have some very, very strong candidates that are going to be running in the Democratic primary, there is a relative front runner that has emerged. And that would be former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. By anyone's standing, former Atlanta Mayor Bottoms appears to be something of a front runner in the Democratic Party. There are other strong candidates. We have a former lieutenant governor by the name of Jeff Duncan, who is an interesting candidate in that former Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan was once a Republican, and he has switched parties to the Democratic Party, and he is running on a very strong message that he is the only person in this Democratic primary race who has the ability to build coalitions large enough to win an actual statewide election. So that's one of the things that former Lieutenant Governor Duncan is arguing. Former DeKalb County CEO Michael Thurmond is also a strong Democratic candidate, the only Democratic candidate running in the primary who himself has actually won a statewide office, in this case, labor commissioner. We also have former Senator Jason Estevez, who is growing in popularity as a possible Democratic candidate for governor. So the Democratic Party has strong candidates going into the primaries, but I would argue that the former mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Bottoms, is the front runner of those. Now, in terms of the Republican Party, which is the incumbent party, they are missing their actual incumbent. Obviously, as we said, the governor cannot run again. There are two candidates that are emerging as possible front runners. The first, and arguably one of the strongest, is former Lieutenant Governor or Lieutenant Governor Jones, and also Lieutenant Governor Jones has the all-important endorsement of President Trump. So that is still very much a significant factor in a purple state like Georgia that still has incredibly deep, dark red, large areas of the electorate. So that endorsement by President Trump for Jones is important. We have another candidate by the name of Rick Jackson. I'm sure that everyone here has seen Rick Jackson. This is someone who has spent already an enormous amount on advertising. You've seen a lot of commercials. He is running as that outside the party candidate. He's running in a very Trumpian fashion, if you will, as the non-political candidate. So those two are serving as two of the predominant candidates in the Republican Party. We also have Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and Attorney General Chris Carr are also significant candidates in the Republican Party. Secretary Raffensperger has the possible option of bringing in bipartisan support. I don't know if anyone remembers all that occurred in the 2020 election and President Trump being actually audio recorded speaking to Secretary of State Raffensperger about finding additional votes that he would need to win the state of Georgia. Raffensperger came out as someone who commanded a great deal of respect from Republicans and Democrats alike by not allowing partisan politics to influence his decisions as Secretary of State. So I think Raffensperger could be a strong candidate. At the end of the day, if I had to pick the best way to describe the two parties going into the gubernatorial election as they go into primaries, I would argue that the Democrats have incredibly strong candidates with one emerging as a possible frontrunner. And I would also look at the Republican Party candidates as having some strong candidates, but being a little bit more wide open. I think we're going to see a lot of exciting political maneuvering as we go into the primaries. I am confident that the primaries will result with runoff elections. I think it's a very good chance that Democrats and Republicans won't get a majority vote for any of their candidates. So this could be a relatively lengthy process. But overall, it's a wide race with a variety of viable candidates, and I think it's going to be an exciting race to look forward to, especially the primaries. With that, I'll turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Kavli, to fill in the many blanks that I have left.
Thank you, Professor Hall. I don't think there's really too much in the way of gaps. But anyway, I would just like to add in on the Republican side. There's studies that have been done on late entering candidates at all kinds of levels of government and in all manner of offices. And the conclusion of those studies, the overwhelming conclusion of them, is that the late entrant makes a big splash. In this case, the late entrant would be on the Republican side, would be Jackson. But if the predictions are accurate on those findings for this, we would predict that Jackson is going to be a bit like a shooting star. He's going to sparkle up there for a little bit, and then by the time we actually have the primary on May 19th, he'll be quite possibly dead in the water. So we'll see what happens there. The other candidates besides Jones have greater staying power. Thing that's hurt Raffensperger probably is that because he backed the wrong horse, if you're a strong Republican in Georgia back in 2020, then particularly in a runoff, if the turnout, again, a lot of studies out there, but what happens in turnout in primaries are low, turnout in primary runoffs are even lower. But the people that turn out are the more ideologically focused, the more strong partisans, as the literature likes to call them. If that happens, if the runoff is between Jones and Raffensperger, I would say that Jones has an edge going into that. Now, because in the Republican Party, this is a purple state. However, the Republican Party here in Georgia overall is very, very tight with the Make America Great Again movement, very associated with President Trump. President Trump actually made a fool out of a lot of us poli-sciers because he did what we said you couldn't be done. Which was he went into those rural counties and places like here in Georgia, and he pulled out voter turnout levels that we in political science said you couldn't do. We said the well would run out. Well, he dug the well deeper. So if that happens, if Trump comes down here, there's a very good chance that Jones can get up there. With a lot of help within that. Now, on the Democratic side, I agree that it's this is Bottom's race to lose. She has the endorsements, she has the money, she has the polls, she has the name recognition, and she has the metropole of Atlanta, and if you put all those things together, she's going to be hard to overtake. Now, I agree totally. Jeff Duncan has a shot, particularly because we have open primaries here in Georgia, and if a bunch of independents come out and they say, well, I need somebody, I want somebody to overtake Burt Jones because I'm so mad at Donald Trump or whatever. There's a chance for Duncan. Now, is there a chance for the others? I'm not so sure about that. I think if there's a runoff on the Democratic side, and I'm wrong all the time, but we'll see. If there's a runoff on the Democratic side, I would think it would be Bottoms versus Duncan. But we'll see. We'll see what happens on it. So, but this should be a very interesting election because this is going to be, and again, there's a lot of literature and political science that looks at state and local politics that has found that increasingly state and local politics have been nationalized. And I think the gubernatorial election here in Georgia has a great chance for that to happen. And in particular, because the stakes are so high, or at least perceived to be so high, I think you're going to see a lot of money coming in from the outside. I think you're going to see a lot of people coming in from the outside. Once we get past the primary and we have a big two, I think you'll see a lot of national involvement. I think there'll be a lot of national media. Maybe not as much here in the primary, but look for it after we do a runoff or whatever we have to do to get to the nominees. You're going to see a whole lot happening in here. One thing, let's say Bottoms is the Democratic nominee. You know, she has her last job in politics. She worked directly for Joe Biden. So there's a very strong chance that we'll get the heavyweights of the Democratic Party coming down here. Now, by the same token, let's say it's Jones on the Republican side. We might get tired of seeing Trump, that he comes down here so much, and so on and so forth. So because a lot of these things are on the line, or at least, again, there's a perception that they're on the line. And I will say this as well. Kemp is not going to be involved in these direct elections. But I will say this, I'd like everybody in the audience maybe to keep an eye on our current governor, because I think down the line, we might see him again in some other efforts, maybe at the national level. Now, they tried to recruit him to run for the Senate, and he turned it down. But that might have been a political choice based on, well, the Republican brand is not doing so well right now. I don't know if all of you looked at the poll numbers right now, but they're helping the Dems and hurting the Repubs right now. Kemp might be making a strategic choice on there. There's rumors about him and running for the big job in 28. I would also keep an eye on Brian Kemp because I don't really think he's necessarily done with politics. Even though he turned down running for the Senate, I think he might have his eyes set on that big White House at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Okay, anyway, I think that's more than enough for that question. So we'll shut up.
Yeah, I can't agree with you enough there on Brian Kemp. I think he is in a brilliant position to run in 2028 for president, because you'll have a Republican Party that may lose the midterm elections of 2026. They may be decimated in the 2026 elections. And there might be a large base of traditional Republicans who are absolutely tired of the MAGA movement, in that we don't know what will be happening with the war in Iran. We don't know what will be happening with the tariffs. So there could be a great opportunity for Kemp. And I would say, unless he just isn't interested, but there is no human being in the history of America that's not interested in running for president. So great point there.
Great. Yeah. Just kind of as a follow-up before we move on to the next kind of scripted question, both of you, I think, kind of really focused on the horse race as we talk about it in political science. I'd be curious if you would, either of you, have any thoughts about, are there any real significant issue positions that are separating the candidates, either on the Republican side or the Democratic side, or is it just sort of, is the main analysis is just kind of who's got the best position, who has the best endorsements, kind of the more horse race sort of stuff. I don't know if either of you have any particular thoughts you want to add on that. Dr. Hall, perhaps?
Great question. Yes. There are some traditional Democrat versus Republican issues that are up for debate again anytime there's an election at the state or federal level. When you look at the Democratic, most of the Democratic candidates, I think, are going to be pushing for more Medicaid expansion. That is something that is a huge issue that has not had success at the federal level. Georgia is still one of the, I believe, 12 to 13 states that have not yet opted in to the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act by the Obama administration. So that is a huge issue that will be in Georgia politics right up into the point that Georgia, I'm going to say, eventually decides to jump onto the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid expansion wagon of sorts. Also, affordability, that's going to be another major issue that any Democratic candidate running across the entire country, I don't care if it's for mayor, governor, or for dog catcher, if you are a Democratic candidate, you are going to be screaming from the top of your lungs affordability. You're going to be screaming about inflation, and you're going to be talking about things like tariffs, which obviously governors have little to absolutely no power over. But I think that's going to be a major issue. I think for the Democratic candidates in particular, it's going to be easy. They are going to be running against many of the policies of the Trump administration and applying them to the state level. For the Republicans, it's going to be something of a, anytime anyone has ever questioned President Donald Trump's ability to do something, they tend to be wrong. President Trump, I will give him credit. He has, as Dr. Kavli mentioned, he has a history of proving professional political scientists wrong. The question is, how much are they going to lean into President Donald Trump? His popularity numbers, his approval ratings right now are at the lowest in his entire career. He is in the mid to high 30% range, depending on the polls that you look at. So on the one hand, when you're talking about that core MAGA vote, which Georgia definitely has a great deal of, obviously being endorsed by the president will help. And when you look at the unpopularity of President Trump with Republicans, not having that endorsement will also help. So it'll be interesting to see how the Republicans maneuver that. I think the Democrats have a much easier go of it in terms of the overall issues, and I think they'll be pushing for things like Medicaid expansion, increased spending on education, and infrastructure development programs. The Republicans will be pivoting off of whether they do or do not fully embrace what is Donald Trump or go against it.
The only thing I would like to add is I think that if you look at some of the stuff that's come out and some of what they said, look for a debate over education, particularly public education, especially higher education. In particular, if Jones is the Republican nominee, he doesn't like professors. So it's a good thing he isn't here because he'd probably have John and I killed. But there's Bottoms would be the opposite. For that, whether it was Duncan, he'd be the opposite. Also, take a look at the voter access. Voter access positions. You'll have the Republicans talk a lot about rule of law, and you'll have the Dems talk a lot about voter suppression. Look at the same thing, see different stuff. Also, the certain other issues, DEI. Again, the Dems will promote its return, and the Republican will probably push for its down to, particularly if Jones is the candidate. In general, I would say about the issues of immigration. Again, talk about the nationalization of things. These issues of immigration, these issues of crime, law enforcement. You're going to have the rule of law Republicans, and immigration enforcement, and opposition to illegal entry, and so on and so forth. And of course, the Democrats are going to be the opposite on all that, and they're going to say, well, this is blatant, xenophobic, locking people up, throw away the key because they have brown skin, and that sort of stuff, that sort of thing. A final area that you might see here in Georgia, I don't know, because I'm not sure how much the Dems are really associated here in Georgia with this, but some of these issues that go around some of the the cultural issues. You could see some talk about arguments about the role that religion plays or ought to play in the public sector, and the role about other issues, how that works, and those cultural issues. Keep an eye out for those. And of course, the big thing about affordability, I would just say this about the affordability. The big thing was he's doing right now. It has been stuff like housing, but I think unless something really changes with our current activities in the Middle East, which the president says it's going to be over in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and of course he said that 2 to 3 weeks ago. So who knows? But anyway, if we still have high gas inflation, any Republican across this country, even a pretty strong Republican like a Burt Jones here in Georgia, is going to have a problem in that general election. Because people respond to they do respond to pocketbook issues, but they tend to respond to it, again, the studies indicate, what they call a sociotropic fashion, meaning not just how it really impacts me, but how it impacts everybody else. And it's something that they sit around a water cooler and they talk about and they complain about. And there's another thing that goes out there about particularly midterm elections. They tend to be more negative than they are positive. And if we look at the framing for this thing we're at right now, this is a canonical case for a negative election. And so the Republicans are, and this isn't just true for the governorship, this is true for the state legislature, this is true for the Congress, this is true for the Senate. They have to have an answer to the Democrats' attacks on these areas. Sometimes it's a lot easier to be on it's sort of the politics is sort of the opposite of the military. Military, you want to be in the defense, but in politics, it's actually a lot of times easier to be in the offense. And so the Dems are kind of in offense on this election cycle. So look for that, and not just in the governor's election, but really throughout all these elections, really all across the country. Can the Republicans hold back the Democratic challenge? See, in a midterm election, very often the opposition party to the president gains at the expense of the president. But the president's party's then job is, well, can they play enough of a defensive game that they can keep those losses to the minimum, or maybe actually, in the somewhat historic case, of actually gaining. But their real goal is to survive, if you will. So we'll see what happens on that. But that'll be something to look at. But there's lots of issues that are out there. But I think that the money issues are going to be really big. But there's other stuff that'll come along. And again, professors duck and cover. That's all I say. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Caverly. So just one brief reminder for everybody that's joining us. Don't forget that we are accepting your questions in the chat as well. So if you do have a question, a follow-up question, or another question you feel like we ought to ask, please do share that in the chat. Having said that, we do have some other prearranged questions, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next one of those. So our last kind of election question, I guess. So also on the Republican side, competition's underway to choose a candidate to face off against Senator Jon Ossoff in November's election. So we have Congressman Buddy Carter and Mike Collins, not the astronaut, running against Derek Dooley, who's kind of Governor Kemp's handpicked candidate. If you don't know who Derek Dooley is, he's son of a former UGA football coach and a former head football coach in his own right at another school up north. So are there any issues that are distinguishing the candidates among the Republicans? Does it seem like that Kemp's endorsement is helping Dooley all that much? What's kind of the state of play in that Republican race to try to perhaps displace Senator Ossoff, which I guess a few months ago might have seemed a little more easy to do than is now?
Okay, so as far as well, again, I would reference some of my previous comments about Kemp to watch out for Kemp. But in the immediate here, remember about Kemp that he didn't back the right horse. He's like Ratzenberger. He didn't back the right horse back in 2020. And so in a primary, with what Dick Fennell's called the primary electorate, the primary electorate is more, in this case, Republican, more hardcore Republican. Even though we have open primaries here, which means that you don't just have to be a Republican to participate in a Republican primary. Overwhelmingly, most of the people that participate in that primary will be Republicans. And the Republicans have, if you look at polling on Republicans, Professor Hall wisely pointed out that President Trump's having a lot of problems. He's deep underwater in polling right now. If you're president, you get dropped below 40% in the polls. That's a bad place to be. That's what the political scientists would tell you, and that's where Trump is right now. But if you look among Republicans, he still does pretty well. And that's who's going to show up in the primary electorate. So the Kemp endorsement of Dooley, I would argue, is not helping Dooley as much as you might think it would be, despite the fact that Brian Kemp, by most measures, has had a reasonably successful government as a governor of Georgia. Mostly because, again, he's, Trump says bad things about old Brian Kemp from time to time, and it's not going to have as much help. Now, what does help the others? Well, okay, Carter's. I looked some stuff up. Carter's got money, right? So now, always remember this again. If you want to believe some of the behavioral empirics of political science, money matters. Money's important. But money does not buy votes. So at the end of the day, you have to be able to connect with the electorate. You have to be able to win on your own terms. But money is a factor. And Buddy Carter's got some money. He's got money. His opponent, Collins does not have as much money, but he has endorsements. And endorsements are important. Again, but by what the literature would tell you is that, again, at the end of the day, nothing beats votes. You got to connect with the electorate. And Collins has some evidence in the polling that I looked at that he has done that. And so he's in maybe a little bit better spot because of that matter. Now, the great difficulty, whichever one of these guys wins the Republican primary for senator, is that they're going to, in the general election, they're going to have to go against an incumbent who's running for re-election. And the incumbent that they're running against is Jon Ossoff. And Jon Ossoff has been about as successful as a Democrat can be statewide in a place like Georgia. He really shows the purpleness of this state, and that's because Ossoff he checks enough boxes in the Democratic column that keeps him solid, but he also checks enough boxes a lot of times, policy-wise, particularly, that he picks up a lot of independent support. And believe it or not, Ossoff has even gotten Republicans to vote for him. And for a Republican to vote for a Democrat in this state, I mean, you got to be, I know Easter is coming up, but you got to be in challenge with JC himself. But Ossoff has managed to do that. I mean, he's a very, so whichever one of these cats win, and I would think it's down to Collins or Carter. If I had to bet money, I'll go with Collins, but I don't really know, but for sure. But they're going to have to go against Ossoff. and Ossoff is going to be a very credible incumbent. Run for. Keep in mind that incumbents normally win re-election, so that's he's got the empirics on his side on that. But nonetheless, as far as a lot of the issues we've actually kind of already covered, because the same issues that are affecting the governor's race are affecting the senatorial race. Now, in fact, I would say if you want to find for a difference, I would say that the senatorial election will be even more nationalized than the gubernatorial because of the role that senators play in national politics. Senators do fundamentally represent their states. They're ambassadors from the state in the old political theory terms, but they are also national power brokers under themselves. And it's very often not uncommon to find at least half or more of the Senate that is at least considering running for the big job at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue in the White House. So I would keep an eye out for even a greater nationalization of the issues, particularly some of these debates over immigration, some of these debates over some of the cultural issues. And the big one, I go back on those pocketbook economic things, whether it's Carter or Collins or Dooley pulled out, they're going to have to go against Ossoff, and his lieutenants are going to hammer down gas's X amount of money. Now, they might get lucky, right? This whole epic fury might be over, right? But even with that, there's a difficult thing because you see it. You got one thing for those of you who are in economic classes right now, economics is kind of like a great big ship. It can't turn on a dime. Once you start heading down one way, and right now that way is not that great. To turn that around is a bit difficult, and it takes time. It takes time to reduce those prices. It takes time for the inflationary effects to calm down. It takes time for the fallout to occur. And of course, increasingly, remember the Republican Party is reliant upon the white working class to get their winning margins. And the white working class right now is getting their butt kicked economically. Now they are the more, behind the big guy up there in the White House, but will they still be behind the big guy? Well, as John had pointed out, Professor Hall pointed out, with the poll numbers, maybe not so much. So we'll see where it's at that point. But nonetheless, I think I will turn over to Professor Hall, who will be able to speak more in-depthly and more intelligently about this topic.
I don't think so. I think you really covered it perfectly there. The one thing I would do, I would jump on to what you just said. I think the biggest reality for this Senate race is President Donald Trump. If Operation Epic Fury isn't over and the Strait of Hormuz is still closed in November and gas isn't just over $100 a barrel, but it's over $250 a barrel, which is unimaginable, I will just go ahead and hand this over to Senator Ossoff. He has that incumbent advantage. He also has the advantage of a shockingly unpopular American president in the opposing party who could be even more unpopular by November. So I think a lot of this race is going to pivot on the actions of President Trump. Because you're right, the economy doesn't move rapidly, and the direction of the Trump administration in many of their decisions, particularly on the tariffs, particularly on the war in Iran, are harming the economy. They are increasing the prices of gas. Just to show the significance of President Trump and what he says, the markets have been fundamentally crashing. I think you could go so far as to say that the NASDAQ was in a correction. It was down 10% year to date. But early Monday morning or Sunday night, President Trump mentioned that he was open to the possibility of a ceasefire with the Strait of Hormuz still partially closed. And since then, Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, the markets have just exploded. So I think it's going to come down to a lot of President Trump and his popularity. You are right. Money does, in many ways, dictate not all of the realities, but it's important. And the Republican candidates have varying degrees of money. Congressman Carter has a little over $4 million. Collins has a little over $2 million. The Governor Kemp supported and endorsed Derek Dooley with all of his coaching expertise, looking to pull a Tommy Tuberville. He has a little over $2 million in funding, but Jon Ossoff is coming into March with $25 million in funding. So he has a massive campaign war chest. He is an incredibly gifted politician, and he's also, I don't know if we pointed this out, this is the only Senate election. This is the only Senate race in a state that was won by President Trump in 2024. As we all know from our 1101 classes, the 100 U.S. senators serve 6-year terms. So we only re-elect a third of them every 2 years. And this is the only election that involves a senator from a state that President Trump lost that's being held by a Democrat. I think it has the possibility of being an incredibly close race. But I think if President Trump's policies don't change dramatically, particularly with the incredibly unpopular war in Iran, that he himself on the campaign trail promised that he would never do, if that continues all the way into November, outside of 1,000 other problems that's going to cause for the country, is going to cause significant problems for any and all Republican candidates. I think it's interesting that President Trump has not yet endorsed a Republican candidate in the gubernatorial election, in the Senate race in Georgia. It's actually kind of shocking that he has not yet endorsed someone, but we will see. And his endorsement, again, depending on how his administration navigates the remainder of 2026, it could be a blessing or it could be a curse. I do want to point one other thing out, and this has absolutely nothing to do with Senator Jon Ossoff or his challengers. We are currently, and I'm kind of going off script here, we're currently in the midst of a runoff for the 14th Congressional District. That's another incredibly exciting election that is being caused by the vacating of her office by Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene for the Georgia 14th Congressional District. Now, we've covered this in class. For anyone who's not familiar, the 14th Congressional District is the farthest most northwestern part of Georgia. It is, I believe, one of the most politically conservative congressional districts of all 14 congressional districts in the state of Georgia. And it is going to a runoff between Democrat Sean Harris and Republican Clayton Fuller. That is shocking because it's amazing that any Democrat had any success whatsoever in the Georgia 14th. That is overwhelmingly, I would say, again, due to the unpopularity of the current Trump administration's policies. No Democrat, statistically speaking, has any business being even remotely successful in the Georgia 14th Congressional District. And Sean Harris, there's the 14th, Sean Harris, both veterans, has shown incredible success. Now, going into the runoff, when you don't have that Republican vote diluted by many other Republican candidates, I'm not in any way projecting that Sean Harris is going to win the 14th Congressional District. In fact, if I were putting money on it, well, I'm not going to say where I would go, but it is impressive that Sean Harris has had the success he has had in the absolute most ruby red congressional district in the state of Georgia. So that's something to keep an eye on. I should have looked this up. The runoff election is coming up very soon. It's not at the tip of my head. March 10th. So March 10th. For anyone here that's not in the 14th Congressional District, you can't vote. So don't worry about going out to vote. But that will be an interesting election that we'll see what happens. But again, back to the Senate, it should be a fascinating election. And depending on the realities of American macroeconomics, I think that Jon Ossoff will have an easier or a harder time. But again, very strong candidate in Jon Ossoff, and I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you very much. We did have a follow-up question in the chat, just very briefly. Elizabeth asks, can only people in the 14th district vote for that? And that is yes, only people that live in that district are able to vote in that runoff that's coming up very soon. So let's see. Okay, so moving on. So we're going to turn to talk a little bit about the state legislature during the second half of our discussion today. And just to get us some basic kind of definitional ideas, tomorrow is the what's called sine die. So what is sine die? What does that mean? It's not sign or die. And how does that relate to the General Assembly's calendar for its meetings this year? Dr. Hall?
Great question. It does seem like sign or die, because this is basically the end of the road for legislation at the state level for that particular legislative session. The legislative session in Georgia is not like that in Congress, in that Congress has a much longer, more extended term that kind of goes year round. But they have 40 days. The legislative term for the state legislature is 40 days. And by the 40th day of the legislative session, legislation from both chambers must be successfully passed through both chambers and ready for the governor, or they are dead. So that's basically what tomorrow is in sine die. It's the 40th day of the legislative session. The Latin, I looked this up, it stands for without day. And to this day, I've never quite understood that. But sine die is the last chance that legislation has. If it's not passed through both chambers at that point, it is dead for the year. And then the governor has, I believe, 40 days afterwards to sign or veto the legislation. So this is something that there isn't really a federal equivalent to in terms of at the end of a congressional session, other than the session just ending and a new Congress being sworn in on January 3rd. But that's fundamentally what sine die is. There might be more historically interesting elements that Dr. Cavalier or Dr. Lawrence can add to it, but that's my 2 cents.
Oh, well, I don't have much of anything to add, except that maybe a little bit of context. So why do they end the legislative session? Well, I saw a thing about there. Let me see that question here. I think I can. Is it the same date for every state? No, it's not the same date for every state. It's based on their own state constitution and state statutes and that sort of thing. So on that note, I would just say this, that so there's really, well, the literature gets in the weeds on this, but there's really two big extremes in when it comes to evaluating state legislatures. So on one end, there are professional legislatures. These in the studies are the ones that are on the rise. A professional legislature is a year-round legislature or near year-round legislature. They have full committee staffs. They pay their legislators a lot of money. They give them a lot of funding for offices and various things. It's a job. In other words, you're a legislator like you are a congressman or a senator. That's not the kind of legislature we have. On the other end is what some of the literature calls a citizens legislature. Others call them an amateur legislature. And they're actually the older ones. And those are the ones that date all the way back to colonial times. And they're actually based off local government from England back in the 16th and 17th centuries. And those are seem to be part-time. So when you're a legislator, the expectation is in there that you have a real job. And the real job is not being a legislator. Your real job is back home being a lawyer or whatever it is that you do. And you go and you report in and you have this set period of time, which runs the gamut in most places. Some of it's as short as a month. Some of it's as long as about 4 to 5 months. Georgia, we're at that kind of hit around that 4-month category. And you have a certain amount of time to finish your agenda. And if you don't, and this is something from legislatures generally, whatever their legislative session is, whether it's 1 month or it's a whole year, whatever does not get done in that is dead. And you got to start all over again. Now you say, why would you do that? Well, you do that because of the reason why you have legislative governance, which is that it's a way of keeping the government limited. It's a way of keeping the government under the control of the people. It's if you will, a small d democratization of governance, that the people rule. And so by you institutionalize limitations on the structure of power, in this case, the legislature. One of those things that you can do, besides things like limiting their budget and term limits and all that kind of stuff, and you just say, look, you've got 30 days, 40 days, 45 days, 60 days, you got to get it done. If you don't, that's it. That means less will get done rather than more. That means the government will stay smaller. That means the government will be more limited and hence more democratized, more under the control of the people. That's the philosophical stuff and the historical stuff that lines it when you wind up with things like sine die. Anyway, so I just wanted to add that in there. Hopefully, maybe that clarified things about as much as mud on a foggy day. But anyway.
Great. Yeah. I think the only thing I would add is just to follow up on Dr. Hall's point about sine die and the definition, right? That is, as he says, without date, right, or without day. Basically, what my understanding is that comes from the idea that they are adjourning sine die, which means literally they are adjourning without a scheduled date to meet again, with the assumption that. In Georgia, like most states, the governor can call for a special session, and so theoretically they could be meeting again before the next election if the governor were to call a special session. It's been a while since the governor called a special session in Georgia, so that's a possibility. Most state legislatures, do have that possibility. The other thing I would add to Dr. Cavali's point, and this kind of follows on from Jack's question in the chat about the dates and schedules and that sort of thing, is like I said, there's that big spectrum between very professional state legislatures. Often we see these in so-called blue states. Illinois and California and New York are kind of known as state legislatures that are in many ways very comparable to Congress in terms of how much they meet and that sort of thing, right? Dr. Cavali's holding up a map that kind of shows the degree of professionalization. I think green is more professional and red is less professional, right? And then on the other hand, you have states like Texas and North Dakota, where not only are they a part-time legislature, but they only meet every other year, right? In regular session. And so, like in Texas, for example, and North Dakota, they have to pass a budget that lasts 2 years. What would be some reasons for a special session? Usually that's just because some new issue has come up. Oftentimes it's a budget issue or something like that, where particularly when revenues, the money coming in, we'll talk more about revenues in a bit, isn't keeping up with the amount of money that's going out. If there's a recession or if there's some big emergency or something that requires a lot more spending than was expected, right? Those are usually the major reasons. Occasionally they'll be done for political reasons, like for example, in Texas, it's been used for things like redistricting, or if the governor isn't getting something through the legislature that he or she wants to get through, sometimes they have the ability to sort of force an agenda on the legislature. If they have a pet issue or something where the legislature is saying, we don't want to do this, and then they can just sort of summon the legislature back and say, we want you to do this, and then there's kind of a back and forth sometimes there. And it kind of depends, like I said, one of the neat things about state and local politics, and whether you're taking the class currently with Dr. Gentry, or have taken the past with Dr. Cavali or Dr. Hall, or is that the 50 states do state legislatures differently. That's one of the beauties of federalism, or one of the curses of federalism, is that every state has kind of their own little quirks and approaches and that sort of thing. The only other thing I would add, kind of following on from the idea of what the purpose of sine die and the purpose of how legislative terms work, is this is something that comes from the British Parliament, where basically a parliament is a distinct thing, right? So each parliament meets, it takes care of business, and then it adjourns, and everything that doesn't get taken care of dies, right? And that's essentially what we've inherited, in most legislative systems around the world have inherited, is this idea that each Congress, each state legislative meeting, whatever, is a distinct thing, right? And then anything that is not taken care of during that period, it can be revived in a future session, right? But at the end of the day, if it doesn't pass, if it doesn't get through the process, it starts back at zero again. The idea is these are distinct meetings. They're, in Georgia, for example, between elections, there is a single period, if you will, where the legislature meets 2 times. Bills that theoretically didn't pass last year could still pass this year, but everything that's still on the agenda when the legislature ultimately adjourns, presumably tomorrow or after a special session, would be dead. In the new, when the state legislature meets again in 2027, they'll start again with House Bill 1, Senate Bill 1, that sort of thing. So anyway, just wanted to elaborate a little on that. So speaking of the General Assembly, right, one of the critical tasks every year is to set a budget. And in Georgia, those budgets run, unlike at the federal level where they run from October to September normally, continuing appropriations and stuff aside. In Georgia, we use a July 1st through June 30th calendar, right? So it's a little different. So what are some of the highlights of both the upcoming budget for next fiscal year, which will start in July, and also the legislature also passed an amended budget for this fiscal year to kind of backfill some funding and stuff like that for programs and stuff. So what are some of the things that the legislature has decided to do budget-wise? I think it's Dr. Cavali's turn to lead off.
All righty, thank you. So I guess the big thing, I guess the main story is that the budget was going to be smaller, and here in the last few days they've been trying to make it a little bit bigger because what had happened was the governor requested a certain amount of money, and the state legislature said no, not that much money. We're gonna cut it back. But before they hit the sine die, they have been grappling over putting some of that money back in. Now, if everything goes through, at least the information that I got, the budget will move to $43.7 billion. In other words, if they get everything, they'll add back about $1.4 billion back to basically the governor's dream list. So along with that, what is one of the big things of interest to the budgeting is, and perhaps to everybody here, is a one-time tax refund, which will amount to certain amount in property tax rebates, upwards of $850 million. And also income tax rebates, and the income tax rebates will be per person $250, or for a couple filing jointly $500. So you put those two together, those two tax cut schemas together, $2 billion total refund. Now, understand, important about that, that's a one-time thing. So that's not a this is a way we're going to do it from here on out. So that's part and parcel of when Governor Kemp ran for re-election back in 22. He said, "Give me my job back, and I'm going to give you some money." And of course, he's a good person to do that because, being a Republican, they are on, if you will, the better tax cutting party writ large. It's not that Democrats never cut taxes, but it's more of a Republican thing to do. It ties up with limited government, with the promotion of elite interests. If you help the top, it helps everybody else, and all that kind of stuff. So that sort of money. There's some other things that are in there that are very interesting, that I think are worthy of note. Speaking of Governor Kemp, there's a a certain amount of money going to bonuses to state employees. A total amount of $600 million, about $2,000 a piece to state employees. So, Professor Lawrence will be able to pay his light bill now. There's also a needs-based scholarship. By the way, we talked a little bit before about the interesting fact of, even in Georgia, even the Democrats are often a bit within about saving money or sending back money to the people in one way or another. And so one of these is Kemp put this through, but as a needs-based scholarship. That's a dream. They call it the Dream Scholarship. $325 million. Now, where did they get that money from? Well, about half of it actually came from a budget surplus, about $145 million. So, there are also money for grants to communities, which includes an interesting one to fight veterans homelessness. $5 million. The total community grants $50 million. That's money that's given to local governments, money that the state government is sending down to local governments, and to do different things. There's a regional hospital, if it goes through, that's specific to mental patients. That's $400 and some million. And a prison bed expansion, if it goes through. And to help the overcrowding issue that we have in our prisons in this state. And then there's, of course, everybody's favorite and also everybody's worry, get more money for road construction and road repairs. So we ain't never going to be able to drive on I-75 in this state. But anyway, express lanes, the specific thing that the governor wanted to put in on I-75. Also interchanges on Route 316. And of course, general money at the local level for what the old days they used to call internal improvements, local roads, bridges, and so on and so forth. Henry Clay would be happy. But the budget bill, at least I saw the numbers here, the House passed it. It's House Bill 973, for those that care, want to look it up. They passed it 169-2, and the Senate passed it unanimously. So that's actually, by the way, in literature on budget studies within legislatures, believe it or not, for all of the conflict that we currently have over this business at the national level with the Department of Homeland Security, budgets at the state level overwhelmingly at the end of the day go across the line pretty easily. And a lot of that comes from this. In most state constitutions, including Georgia's, you cannot run a debt for any significant period of time. So that forces them at the end of the day to make bargainings and compromise and persuasion and to sign off on stuff, and even stuff that they maybe don't want, to get it through. In the big Congress, what they also used to do, use a lot of it until everything fell apart. They used to use what's called omnibus bills. They put all the budget into one bill, and that was a way they could. But they did that to get across the line. And so, but at the states and the local states, you don't have to do that as much because they're incentivized to get it done. Because remember, budgeting is something they have to do. I mean, it's not we talked about sine die here. There's things legislatures, if you do the studies on it, that you'll find that this is true in comparative politics as well. They do basically two things. They have the power of initiation. That just means they make policy. That normally means a law. But also they have the control of the money. And that's budget. You see, if you without money, you can't do anything. And so the legislature, part of legislative supremacy, that power's been given to them. And so that's how we get through a lot of this stuff. There's a cost of living adjustment for retirees. They're trying to get that across the line. And something that there's some more money for the disabled, $20.9 million. That was an interesting one. One that the professors here, we for all of our differences, we could probably come together on this one that we do not like. They're going to cut $123.5 million from the university system. That's to help pay for everything else. Because remember, you got to think about something for the students out there. You got to think about something. If you win office in a place like Georgia telling you, here's what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you back money, then that means you got to have money to do stuff. So with what's left, where are you going to get the money from? Well, money that was previously thought to be allocated, we could chop that down. And who's a good target? Well, if you have a Republican legislature, which we do, who's a good target? Universities, because you turn on Fox and Friends and all that stuff, they're going to tell you about your woke professors and how wild and crazy we are, and so we're a big target, and so we're an easy target, we're a soft target, so they hit us. But to someone working with, which helps you, what hurts the colleges though often helps K through 12, which is not as politicized. And so we see this in the budget as well, $70.4 million for literacy coaches. Now, what I would say about all of this, sort of in my conclusion here, is that a thing to look at with budgetary politics at the state level, and this is true in the national level as well, though it's not quite as one-to-one, but particularly at the state level, budgets are windows into what the state's political class values. And so you can see a lot of the politics of policy in budgets. And so you should look at this kind of budget and future budgets and debates over budget and think about that lens in the background. This is how program ideological agendas are turned into policy actions. They're turned in via lines in the budget. And so if you look at the budget, you can see what a state, you can compare a state like Georgia with a state like New York or California, and you will see that they have very different budgets. And you will see that those budgets go to very different, the monies go to very different things very often and in different ways. That's a reflection of who runs New York versus who runs Georgia, which is also a reflection of the people that elect them into those positions in the aforementioned New York and Georgia. So without all that, I'm going to turn over to Professor Hall, who's going to conclude things out.
Thank you, Dr. Caverly. Again, I have very little to add to that. It was a phenomenal summary. I think overall, there's one major shift, philosophical shift. A lot of what you were describing in terms of the rebates and the tax relief and all of those one-time projects to return money back to the Georgia voters from that surplus fund that the state of Georgia had grown. A lot of that was from that 2026 amended budget. I think going into 2027, there is a shift in the overall budgetary strategy, and that's going away from those one-time surplus spending packages and back to more typical budgeting. Again, you've covered pretty much everything as well as I possibly could. There is a large focus on education in the 2026-2027 budget. There are extraordinary amounts of money that you mentioned that are being increased, particularly K through 12 funding, about $250 million for lower wealth school districts. There's a great deal of money going into health services. I think roughly 75% of the upcoming budget will be involved with either public education or healthcare. And we'll talk about this in a later question, but there's a major literacy initiative being launched and fully funded to some extent by this upcoming budget, looking to increase literacy rates across the state, looking at hiring or requiring the hiring of literacy coaches in all, I think, K through 3 primary schools. There's a pre-K expansion funding that is being made available student transportation funding. So there's a great deal of returning to normalcy without as many rebates, while also, of course, bringing in some significant tax cuts. There's also going to be some expansion of funding for Hope scholarships, which is a great thing. One of the good things to see on the horizon. Overall, the spending, the surplus that seems to have been the dominant theme of the 2026 amended budget is going to be transferred back to more of a normal budgeting experience, with a lot of the lion's share of the budget going to education and to healthcare, two areas that desperately need it. But with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, because again, you gave a very thorough response.
Okay, thank you all. Dr. Hall, you already kind of alluded to this, so I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit more on this, or if you just want to maybe briefly address it. But the legislature, obviously you mentioned the childhood literacy and things like that. Had they done anything else that's significant regarding K through 12 or higher education? I know that Dr. Kavli mentioned some budget issues that potential cutbacks, although I don't know if that's been finalized in the growth in spending for the university system. The Dream Scholarship, things like that. Anything else you want to elaborate on, or give any more details on, or anything particular that struck your mind?
Absolutely, and this connects with what Dr. Kavli had mentioned earlier. Even though you might see some cuts to higher education, that sometimes does translate to increased funding for K through 12, and I think that's the situation we're going to see here. The K through 12 budget is by far one of the biggest changes that we're seeing in this in this upcoming budget, with this extraordinary literacy overhaul. You could argue that it is one of the top policy priorities for the Kemp administration and for the current legislature going into this budget. I forgot the name of the House bill, but as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be requiring what I think are being informally or formally known as literacy coaches for K through 12 schools statewide that will continue to reinforce this push on basic literacy. And it's generally described as one of the more significant recent educational initiatives for the entire state of Georgia. This is really a centerpiece policy for the state of Georgia. In addition to that, we can hit some topics that I'm sure some of our students might have already been familiar with if you follow local politics, and that is cell phone restrictions. Now, I don't know, I think this has successfully passed. I forgot to triple check this, the House and the Senate, but the cell phone restrictions in schools it's literally exactly what it sounds like, restricting cell phones in, I believe, if not K through 12, it would be K through middle school. And this is controversial in a multitude of ways. On the one hand, you have a large number of voters, and this is one of those unique situations that crosses over party lines. There are many people, myself included, who have children in primary school and in high school at the same time, and it is advantageous to be able to connect to them if we need in an emergency. But at the same time, it's overwhelmingly difficult, if not impossible, to actually teach students who are sitting there staring at their cell phone. I know old people like myself would be on Facebook, but for you young Gen Zs, I'm sure you're on something else, Insta something or Snap something. But that is another controversial piece of legislation impacting K through 12. There are also some bills that are looking at advancing students' rights when it comes to protected political expressions in public schools. This is always a hot button issue. Higher education is not being completely ignored. It's going to be less significant, but still there are some elements of the new budget that will affect higher education, but nothing that jumps off the board to me as being overwhelmingly significant. The big picture, I think, for this upcoming budget is going to be involving the impact on K through 12. That's where the lion's share of the legislative reforms from the budget, I think, are going to impact. With that being said, any other K through 12 or higher education changes, I'll open that up to the rest of the committee. But those are the big issues from my perspective. And I think we have a question.
Oh, okay. So I just looked down here in the chat. Oh, by the way, just a not really an addendum, but just an issue on the so if people that study state legislatures, since the 1940s, the number one thing in a state budget that's across all the states is education. More money is spent on education than anything else. Below that, and before the 1940s, it used to be the number one thing, are the police powers stuff. So a lot of people wonder, well, why are we have all these cops and firefighters? There's a lot of money goes to that sort of thing. Always has. So anyway, that's the number three, by the way, is economic development, and economic development varies depending upon the state and its region, its dominant economic sector. So like, for instance, where the state that I'm a resident of, which is Florida, we're a big tourism state. So lots of money in the budget winds up funneling off into Disney World and stuff. Here in Georgia, our big thing is staple crop agriculture. And it's our number one business. So lots of money, lots of economic development money goes into the peanut crop and the cotton crop and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so those are them. But to address a couple of these questions here. So Elizabeth asked an interesting question about special sessions. Well, so constitutionally, the governor is the one that calls into a special session. Now, why do they do it? Well, okay, one, the big one is they'll do it for emergencies. They'll do it for emergencies. Some major domestic or foreign crisis or whatnot, economically, with the, what's happening with the, if the Strait of Hormuz is held off long enough, you might see Brian Kemp call a legislative session for that. So one is emergencies, could be economic downfall, whatever. But the other one, which is the one that the normative people don't like, is that's done for political reasons. A governor will call a special session to force the state legislature to act upon his agenda or her agenda when they previously have not. And that very often happens under conditions of divided government. And it's it happens more in states that are where if you will, the governor is stronger. Although the governor of Georgia is fairly strong, is what's part of what's called the New South governors. We can thank Jimmy Carter for that. But relatively speaking, in states where governors are really, really strong, like California, they've been known to do that stuff. So that's a very political reason. But the reason, if you will, the non-normative one, the empirical one, is to handle some kind of what's deemed to be some type of emergency. This does exist at the national level. Then it's just you replace the governor with the president, and again, a similar phenomena. Although the Congress stays in session so much now that it's very rare that's done at the presidential level. But for us, with our more amateurish legislature, we've had it. We've had it, and they've done it. If you go back into the history of the Georgia state governorship, it has been done. More common in sort of from about the 1930s, 40s on around E.D. Rivers type forward. Then before that, the governorship in Georgia was really weak. But as the governor grew, one of the measures, by the way, of state governorships as they've grown is how much they use this power regarding special sessions. Okay, so that's a very good question, very interesting question. Christmas tree, Xavier, that's one of my favorite things. So there's a lot of rules on statutes about germaneness, but they're often loose enough. Germaneness just means that if you put something in a bill, it's supposed to relate to the bill as a whole. However, you can get really clever with that, and you can copy and paste entire bills into other bills, especially when you're talking about bill. You're not talking about a constitutional amendment or anything at the state level, and so that is done all the time. In fact, if you looked this budget bill, in all honesty, a lot of that stuff, the moving the money back in after it was pulled out, that's Christmas tree. That's what they're doing. So that's a very good thing you brought up there, Xavier, because yeah, that happens all the time. Um, Elizabeth asked a follow-on question about TSA. That's also a very wonderful and interesting question because remember I said about the nationalization of state elections, and here in Georgia, we should expect this to happen here because we are a firebrand. We are roughly a what they call a two-party competitive state, sometimes called a purple state. So that means we get a lot of media attention. We have, I believe, Atlanta Airport's the busiest airport in the world. It was at one time anyway. I believe, okay, I used to say. So, and this whole bit with TSA, as you know, the government shut down. They weren't getting paid. President Trump just, with a swipe of pen and executive action, he moved some money. That in and of itself is arguably problematic regarding how much money, how much control president really has over money like that. But nonetheless, I would say that these follow-on effects of the government shutdown, the partial government shutdown, the ongoing economic turmoil, the conflict in the Mideast, even maybe some fallout out of what's happening in the Caribbean with the drug boats and all this kind of stuff. All of these are going to manifest themselves in the Georgia election, especially in the senatorial election. But I think to a lesser extent, I think they will at least be in the gubernatorial election. Now, will they be in the state legislative ones? Probably not. Probably not down to that level. But will they be, in local stuff? Probably not. But with the governor and with the Senate, I think that Elizabeth, you are definitely onto something. They're going to be there. There's going to be a lot of talk about it. There's going to be hollering and screaming about it, and people carrying signs and singing songs, and we're going to have a lot to do with it. Okay. So anyway, I will shut up now.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. Yes, probably in our limited time remaining, probably tackle one last question, and that is taxes. So I know that a couple of you mentioned very briefly some of the proposals for taxes and rebates and things like that. Can you provide any additional details on those policies? Is there anything else that you think that we need to elaborate on in terms of either property tax or income tax? I know there's been some back and forth between the preferred pathway between the House and the Senate, where leadership in one chamber wants to push for lowering income tax, where the other chamber is pushing more for property tax relief. How is that tug of war being resolved?
Okay. Am I up again or?
I've lost track, to be honest.
Yeah, I lost track.
Okay.
I thought you were up.
Okay. So number 7 here, the taxes. Yeah. To adjust tax. Yes. Well, the a little bit of what Professor Hall mentioned here is that the tax policy that has really found within this budget is kind of operating outside of the normal run of things. This is a kind of a reward to the electorate. I'm going to give you something. This is the carrot, and because of that, you're going to come out and you're going to give me a benefit. I'm giving you a good. You're going to give me a benefit. You're going to vote for me and my people. Now, I will say this in terms of some of the earlier stuff we talked about here about the elections. There are some of the people that are running for office that, as a part of their agenda that they want to put forth if they're elected, is to do things like this. this is on the Republican side, by the way, to eliminate the state income tax. So I don't know how feasible that is. I don't know if they get the votes for that, but the point is that that's on there. And again, like there was a certain thing they suspended, the governor suspended the gas tax for 60 days. But again, this is another, it's like the one-time tax rebates and the you know, basically a dividend kind of thing. This is not a utter reform of the tax system in Georgia, but there's a potential for that. As I said, there are Republicans running for office who talked about that they want to get rid of the state income tax. That could be a big thing. There's others that have run around and talked about certain cuts for eliminating property taxes for certain groups of people, like seniors. That's not just out here in Georgia. That's in other places too. They're talking about that down in Florida, which I don't know where they think they're going to get the money from, because I mean Florida's filled with old people. They stop paying property taxes, they can have any money. Anyway, so I would say that how you win election to office in a place like Georgia, because of our traditionalist political culture, is to do some form of, here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm not going to do for you. I'm not going to raise your taxes. I'm going to cut your taxes, which means that the operating budget for what the state can do stays low, relatively speaking. And so such initiatives that you have, like some of these K through 12 initiatives, the literacy coaches and whatnot, have to be done within the boundaries of that. And what did they, I go back to my very early comments, what did that do? That keeps the government limited. And so the way tax policy and the way tax proposals are discussed in Georgia manifest that kind of limited government, dual federal model that runs through so much of our politics and policy. And I'm going to turn this over to Professor Hall, who will speak more intellectually about it.
A great point there. I think you hit the major summary there. The big issue that's being dealt with in terms of tax policy is the cuts to income tax. Because again, I believe there is legislation that will look at accelerating income tax cut rates, looking at going from a little over 5% to under 5%, and possibly going as low as under 4%. But there is a continual moving, there's an inertia being created for this call for absolutely eliminating the income tax. I don't necessarily see that, again, happening necessarily anytime soon. It's important to note, if you are not someone who studies tax law a great deal, you might hear cutting the income tax. Absolutely, that's great. I have an income. I don't want to be taxed on my income. But as Dr. Caverly pointed out, you have to have revenue from somewhere. So states that don't have income taxes, or states that get rid of their income tax, they're generally going to make that up with higher sales taxes. Income taxes are famously more progressive, meaning the more income you make, the higher the rates are that you pay. Sales taxes are infamously more regressive, meaning they impact the poor much more than they do the wealthy, because it represents a greater proportion of their total income. So this is a very, very, I would say, possibly dangerous direction that the state of Georgia is going, with the thought of eliminating the income tax completely, because we will have to make up that revenue somewhere else, and usually in a more regressive way. Or we would simply cut services that the state of Georgia has been previously providing. So I do see that we are completely out of time, but on that last note, income taxes and debating the income tax, reducing the income tax, eliminating the income tax, that is without a doubt at the forefront of Georgia politics moving forward in terms of tax policy. And I will turn it over to Chris with 12 seconds left.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Hall. And also thank you, Dr. Caverly, for your responses as well. Thank you for those of you in our audience for joining us today. We are officially out of time, so I want to thank you all for your participation. We will have the video posted of this later on today, hopefully, depending on the vagaries of YouTube and Teams downloading things and things like that. So keep an eye out for that. We do appreciate you all coming, and particularly your questions in the chat. This is our, like I said, our final discussion event for this semester, but we hope you'll join us in the future for future events, and also keep an eye out for other events that are taking place this month and involving the School of Arts and Letters generally, and our department in particular, and things like that. So again, thank you, Dr. Hall. Thank you, Dr. Cavally, and hope everybody has a good evening. And one last thing I do want to let everybody know, or remind everybody about, that you may be aware that, and this may be my geek speaking, but you may be aware that this evening, the launch of the Artemis II mission to send humans back, at least into lunar space, not technically lunar orbit, for the first time in, I think, most of our, if not all of our living memory, is scheduled to lift off this evening. So I think it's about 6:30 or so is when the expected, and last I checked, a couple hours ago, everything seemed to be on track. So the launch window does stay open for a few more days and things like that. But there's a good chance that will happen tonight. And also the president is giving a speech about the Iraq war, or the Iran war. Not the Iraq war. That was a few decades ago. This evening as well. So that may be something you would be interested in tuning in for as well. Either one or the other, perhaps both. So I did want to bring those to your attention if you weren't aware of those, in particularly the Artemis II mission, which has not only the first astronauts to return to the moon or lunar space in recent decades, but also the first Canadian and the first woman. So and the first person of color. So lots of people, and lots of big events taking place in space, because I'm just a space nerd. So what can I say? But anyway, thank you all for coming out, and we'll see you all in the future. And thanks again, Dr. Hall and Dr. Cavally.
Thank you, Matt.
Take care. Thank you all. Live long and prosper. Thank you, everybody.